The manuscript arrived inside a yellowed envelope with no return address, addressed only to me in a shaky hand. On the aged pages, water stains formed patterns that resembled contorted faces. What follows is a faithful transcription of that document, whose origins I was never able to trace completely. All I know is that it was sent from Rome, and the last person said to have it disappeared without a trace 3 days after mailing it. Truth is a labyrinth of mirrors in which each reflection reveals only distorted fragments of the whole. What I'm about to relate was not witnessed by me directly, but was entrusted to me by Father Alexander Trevisan on his deathbed at the small St. Mary of Consolation Hospital, less than a kilometer from the walls of the Vatican. His hands, worn by decades of service to the Church, trembled as he held mine. "I cannot die carrying this with me," he whispered, his voice as fragile as a candle about to go out. "Someone needs to know what Father Pio truly saw." For 6 decades, Alexander served as assistant archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. A methodical, discreet man, he catalogued documents that would never reach public view. A man of few words and unwavering faith, he never showed any sign of mental instability or a tendency toward fantasy. On the contrary, he was known for his rigor and almost scientific precision in handling the Church's historical records. It all began in 1968, weeks before the death of Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. Alexander, then a young assistant, was assigned to organize the confidential accounts of the stigmas and miracles attributed to the Capuchin friar. During this work, he discovered a document sealed with the papal coat of arms, set apart from the rest. Curiosity, a sin he would later call providential, led him to open the envelope that was meant to remain sealed. What he found were not the usual reports of miraculous healings or manifestations of the stigmata, but a testimony by Padre Pio himself, written in his trembling script and addressed directly to Pope Paul VI. The document, dated 1965, recounted an encounter the friar had during one of his visits to Rome, an encounter the Church had deliberately concealed, and that, according to Alexander, would forever change our understanding not only of faith, but of the very nature of reality. Padre Pio had been summoned to Rome to discuss his supposed miracles. During his stay, he was lodged in a simple room on the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace. On the 2nd night, he awoke at around 3 in the morning, the inverted hour of Christ's crucifixion, as he himself noted. He sensed a presence in the room, but it was not the familiar feeling of mystical ecstasy he often experienced. It was something different, something he described as a density in the air, as if space itself were being compressed. At first, Pio believed it to be a demonic manifestation, something he was familiar with after decades of spiritual battles. He began to pray, but the words seemed to lose their meaning as soon as they left his lips. Then he noticed, in the darkest, in corner of the room, a form that could not be adequately described in human terms. It was not exactly a figure, but a distortion of reality, as if something were bending light and space around it. Pio later reported that for a moment he thought he was having a vision of his own death, feeling the displacement of the soul that precedes its separation from the body. But what happened next defied all his theological conceptions. The presence began to communicate, not through words, but through direct impressions in Pio's mind. It transmitted knowledge that, according to him, could have neither human nor angelic origin. The entity, if that term can even apply, revealed to Pio that it was neither demon nor angel, but something existing in the folds between worlds. It spoke of civilizations predating humanity that had built bridges between dimensions, some located exactly where today stand the oldest sites of worship on Earth. According to this entity, the Vatican itself had been built atop one of these dimensional nodes, a point where the membrane between realities is thinnest. Even more disturbing was what the entity revealed about Pio's stigmata. The wounds on his hands, feet, and side were not divine manifestations, but the result of an initial contact with this parallel reality, a kind of recognition mark. Other mystics throughout history, the entity said, had been similarly marked, not by God, but by intelligences existing in the interstices of reality. Horrified by such blasphemous suggestions, Pio attempted to make the sign of the cross, only to find he could not move his arms. The presence then showed him a series of visions, images of underground structures beneath St. Peter's Basilica, chambers not recorded on any official architectural plan, where non-human objects had been stored since the church's earliest days. The most disturbing of these visions showed a particular object, a crystalline device roughly the size of a human skull, inscribed in a language Pio described as pre-Babel. This artifact, the entity said, was secretly revered by a small circle within the Vatican, not as a sacred relic, but as an instrument capable of tuning frequencies between worlds. The next morning, still shaken, Padre Pio requested an urgent audience with the Pope. Paul VI received him privately, with no official record of the meeting. Afterward, Pio was sent back to San Giovanni Rotondo at once and was never called to Rome again. The document ended with the friar's plea that the Pope investigate the secret chambers and destroy the crystalline artifact, which he believed to be a portal to something that must never enter our world. Alexander kept this knowledge, secret for decades, fearing for his life and his soul. Over the years, he discreetly observed patterns that seemed to confirm Pio's revelations. He noticed how certain cardinals and Vatican staff avoided specific areas of the basilica at certain hours of the night. He recorded how often electronic equipment inexplicably failed in certain corridors, and most notably, he documented the transfers. Officials who, after reporting strange experiences, were swiftly removed from their posts and sent to remote parishes around the globe. In 1978, during the brief papacy of John Paul I, Alexander noted an intensification of these patterns. The Pope, known for his simplicity and candor, had apparently begun asking questions about the Church's deepest archives. After only 33 days on the throne, John Paul I was found dead. Officially, it was a heart attack, but Alexander was convinced the Pope had uncovered something related to Pio's account, something certain factions within the Church did not want revealed. In 1986, while cataloguing medieval manuscripts, Alexander came across references to a secret group within the Church called the Custodes Liminis, Guardians of the Threshold. Mentioned in private correspondence between 12th century bishops, the group's mission was to keep the portals between worlds sealed. The references were cryptic, often cloaked in seemingly innocuous phrases about architectural maintenance or relic restoration. That same year, Alexander personally witnessed what he called an incursion. Working late in a remote archive room, he heard a sound he described as paper tearing, amplified 1,000-fold, coming from all directions at once. The air grew heavy, electric, and for a brief moment, he saw fragments of a different reality superimposed on ours. Impossible. Geometric surfaces, colors that had no name in any human tongue. The episode lasted less than 10 seconds, but left him prostrate with a high fever that persisted for 3 days. During that fever, he had visions of a city of non-Euclidean architecture, inhabited by entities whose silhouettes provoked nausea at the mere sight. When he recovered, he found on his left wrist a mark, a pattern of interlaced lines vaguely resembling the architectural plan of St. Peter's Basilica viewed from an impossible angle. In the years that followed, Alexander quietly gathered more fragments of information. He discovered that certain areas of the Vatican were routinely purified through rituals combining traditional Catholic exorcism with possibly pre-Christian practices. He found records suggesting that the very location of St. Peter's Basilica was chosen not only for being the apostles' burial site, but because it was already regarded by the Etruscans as a vent between worlds, a place of exceptional spiritual power. To those seeking the truth behind the veil of consensual reality, I always recommend watching for patterns that echo throughout history. Synchronicities are not coincidences, but clues left for prepared minds. Follow these accounts and connect with others who have had similar experiences. Only together can we unlock the mysteries that surround us. In 1992, Alexander found another disturbing document, a 1950 medical report on Padre Pio, classified ultra-confidential. The report detailed an analysis of tissue samples taken from Pio's stigmata, conducted in secret by Vatican-employed scientists. The conclusions were shocking. The cells around the wounds showed genetic anomalies inexplicable by known human biology, with protein structures not following any recognized human pattern. Even more startling was the observation that these cells resisted decomposition, remaining alive for weeks without nutrients. One scientist noted that under certain lighting, the samples emitted a faint luminescence in patterns resembling microscopic circuits. The report concluded with a recommendation that all samples be destroyed and the investigation terminated for reasons of spiritual security. In 1999, nearing retirement, Alexander was summoned to an unusual task. A high official in the Vatican Secretariat of State asked him to locate and release all documents related to a secret archaeological expedition the Vatican conducted in 1944 within the Roman catacombs. The expedition had been led by Father Dominic Grasso, a Jesuit trained in archaeology and ancient languages. As he assembled these records, Alexander discovered that the team's interest was not in early Christian artifacts, but in a specific chamber sealed with peculiar symbolism. Blend of Christian and older, possibly Sumerian and Egyptian signs. The chamber was found, but the reports on its contents had been removed from the archives, leaving only mentions of a translucent artifact and non-human inscriptions. Most disturbing was the list of 7 men who entered that chamber. 5 died within a year of unconnected causes: heart attack, suicide, car accident, fulminant brain infection, and 1 unexplained disappearance. The 2 survivors were Father Grasso himself, later sent as a missionary to a remote monastery in Tibet where he died in 1951, and a young seminarian named Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II. Alexander began to see connections among these seemingly disparate events: the 1944 expedition, Padre Pio's 1965 account, John Paul I's sudden death in 1978, all pointing to secret knowledge held by a select few within the Vatican, knowledge of entities existing beyond traditional theological categories of angels and demons. In 2005, just before his official retirement, Alexander had his second direct experience with the phenomenon. Working in the rarely visited lower stacks, where documents predating the 10th century were stored, he again felt that density in the air. This time, however, there was no visible rupture in reality. Instead, he sensed a conscious presence observing through my own eyes, as if something temporarily shared my body. The episode lasted about 10 minutes, during which Alexander remained conscious but lost motor control. His hands moved of their own accord, leafing through specific documents as if the entity sought something. When he regained control, he held a 7th century parchment, a fragment of a lost Gnostic text speaking of archons and guardians of the gates existing between worlds. The experience left him deeply shaken, but also certain. What Padre Pio encountered was not an isolated incident. but part of a far broader pattern of interactions between our reality and another. Interactions the Church had been documenting and perhaps facilitating for centuries. In the years after his retirement, Alexander continued his private investigation, corresponding with former Vatican staff, paranormal researchers, and even a theoretical physicist at Rome University studying parallel universe models. Gradually, he developed a theory he called the theology of intersections, the idea that certain places on Earth, including but not limited to the Vatican, function as contact points between different dimensions. According to this theory, traditional religious manifestations, apparitions, miracles, possessions, are culturally conditioned interpretations of interactions with these other realities. Padre Pio's stigmata, in particular, represented an advanced form of biological alteration by these entities, perhaps as part of a study on human physiology or an attempt at symbolic communication. Most disturbing in Alexander's theory was his suggestion that the Catholic Church, or at least certain elements within it, had full knowledge of these entities, maintaining a negotiated coexistence for centuries. This would explain the Church's obsessive concern with specific geographic sites, the preservation of two dangerous relics, and the periodic disappearances of those who approach the truth too closely. In his final years, Alexander became ever more paranoid. He believed he was being followed, that his apartment was regularly searched in his absence. He began stashing his most important documents in multiple locations, trusting copies to different people and instructing them to release the material only if he died under suspicious circumstances. At our last meeting, 2 days before he was hospitalized with symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, Alexander handed me the key to a storage unit containing his greatest discovery, a set of photographs secretly taken in the Vatican in 2001, showing what appeared to be an underground laboratory where priests and scientists examined a crystalline object like the one Pio described. "They are neither angels nor demons," were his last coherent words to me. "They are far older, something that was here before humanity and will be here after we're gone. And the Church does not fight them. The Church guards the gates, yes, but not to keep them out, to control when and how they enter." Alexander died 3 days later. Official cause: multiple organ failure due to sepsis of indeterminate origin. His body was cremated with remarkable speed for public health reasons before any independent investigation could take place. When I went to the storage unit he'd indicated, I found it empty, plainly hastily cleared. Since then, I have gathered the fragments Alexander left behind, trying to complete the puzzle. I have contacted others who had similar experiences, former Vatican employees, independent researchers, witnesses to inexplicable phenomena at religious sites around the world. Slowly, a pattern emerges. Something is happening behind the scenes of reality, something that defies our categories of understanding. Some of those I contacted have vanished mysteriously. Others suffered inexplicable accidents or were suddenly diagnosed with mental illness. A curious pattern emerged. Those who publish their findings sensationally are generally ignored or ridiculed, but continue their lives normally. Those who come too close to concrete evidence that could scientifically prove these interdimensional incursions tend to meet premature ends. 3 months ago, I received an anonymous letter containing only a photograph, an image of a Vatican corridor, seemingly deserted, except for a vertical distortion in the air, like a rippled reflection, in murky water, from which protruded what looked like an elongated limb of impossible anatomy. The photo was accompanied only by a date, September 20th, 1968, the day Padre Pio died. Last week, I began to notice signs of surveillance, cars parked for long periods near my home, strange interference with my electronic devices, a man in a cassock watching me from a distance in public places. That is why I decided to compile everything I know into this document and send it to you, the person Alexander described as having a mind open enough to consider the impossible. I do not know how much time I have left. What I can say for certain is that our understanding of reality is tragically limited. Organized religions are not mere belief systems. They are structures of containment and sometimes portals. The miracles and manifestations we interpret through familiar cultural lenses are only the surface of far deeper, more disturbing interactions between our reality and others. Padre Pio was not simply a mystic bearing divine manifestations. He was someone who glimpsed beyond the veil and paid a terrible price for that knowledge. His stigmata were not marks of sanctity, but scars of contact with something existing in the interstices of reality, something the Church has known about far longer than it is willing to admit. I leave you this information not so you will publish it widely, that would only ensure your discredit, if not something worse, but so that you may investigate with caution, connecting discreetly with others who have had similar experiences. Truth is fragmented, scattered like pieces of a cosmic puzzle among those who have seen too much to ignore it, yet are too afraid to speak openly. As I write these final lines, I feel that familiar density in the air around me. The lamp in my study flickers rhythmically, following a pattern that seems almost intentional. I glance at my left hand and notice that the mark left after my encounter in the archives, that pattern of interlaced lines, appears more pronounced today, pulsing, faintly with a glow that should not be possible. What would you do if you discovered that the reality we perceive is only a thin shell over a far more complex structure? That the institutions we consider pillars of spiritual stability are, in fact, sentinels guarding secrets beyond our comprehension? That figures like Padre Pio were not just saints, but junction points between our world and something existing beyond the categories of good and evil, sacred and profane.